We're thinking about business first as a mindset. What's important to the business rather than what's important to me. What is the outcome that the individual and the organization needs rather than what's the outcome that I need to prove my own worth. In the 20 years, Ash, that we've been tracking what correlates back to business results, the technology never once showed a correlation. When we shift our mindset to really seeing that's where genuinely we personally believe we can contribute our value, the way we think about value then has a knock-on effect in the way that we behave when we're working with the business. And we want the tech to fix the problem, and it won't.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Marketing for Learning podcast. Today, I have an incredible interview that I actually recorded a couple of months ago with Laura Overton. If you've worked in our industry for any time at all, she needs no introduction. She has been a trailblazer in our industry, the original CEO and founder of Towards Maturity, and has since done many incredible things for our industry in helping it progress and look forward using data. I was lucky enough to sit down with Laura and chat about all things marketing for learning because Laura has actually been pushing the marketing agenda in our industry for nigh on 20 years now, believe it or not. So me and Laura sat down and we had a good chat about what's changed, sadly what hasn't, and a lot more. Plenty of laughs involved and such an insightful conversation from someone who really knows their stuff in terms of what moves the needle in our industry. It's jam-packed full of data, it's jam-packed full of insights, and it's absolutely certain to get you interested in how you can create more actionable insights from your marketing strategies within learning. Strap on in, folks. This one's a good one. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Marketing for Learning podcast. Today I am joined by Laura Overton. Hey Laura, lovely to speak to you.
I am so looking forward to this conversation with you, Ash.
Me too. Thank you so much for joining me, and I know that our listeners are going to really enjoy what you've got to say because, dare I say it, you're one of the original trailblazers when it comes to marketing for learning. You've been talking about this since 2004.
Yes. I don't really want to admit to how long I've been talking about this for, but yeah, it was basically after a stint that I had as a marketing leader actually for 3 years. And my background is really predominantly working in the learning and development professional, particularly on EdTech and change management. You've been talking recently about the marvelous Kevin Costner, and if they build it when they come, I was around when that film first came out, and this has always been a challenge, and so it was always interesting for me to see how my experience as a marketing leader overlapped with my passion for driving change in the learning and development industry. So I'm thrilled to be able to have a chat with you learn from you today, Ash. That's what I want to do.
I wish. Come on now. I mean, it sounds like we're very much cut from the same cloth there, because back in my days when I was working as an in-house marketer, I was the same. I was just like, this is a really big problem that no one seems to either recognize or blames it on the tech or things like that, or we just spend money and hope that things change, and I just genuinely couldn't kind of bend my head around it. So I'm glad to hear you kind of have felt the same pain in some ways. Obviously, that's nearly 2 decades ago, believe it or not. Probably gone in a finger click, but what are your kind of major observations? Has much changed, or is it still the same stuff that we're contending with from 20 years ago in terms of how people aren't approaching improving engagement challenges in L&D?
Well, because part of that 20 years for me was actually doing a research study, with learning and development professionals, and for me, the most important part was their learners as well, really getting the voice of the worker into that process. I had a good sense of what was going on between 2004 and 2019 because I watched the data every single year. And I was always looking for what correlates back to business impact. And what changed over that period of time when I was watching the data, well, clearly the technology changed. Clearly the tools, the internet, the iPhone was brought out at that time, Facebook and LinkedIn, and the way that we connect and we collaborate changed. And obviously there's been that major shift since 2019 as well. So what's been changing is the fact that we, as individuals, our workplaces have changed as a result of technology. But what has changed in terms of the practice of learning and development professionals? Well, one of the things that I noticed in my own studies was that the high performing teams, by that, those that were reporting smarter business results, they seem to be embracing a whole range of different, I know you like the word mindset, but a whole range of different mindsets. And I'm so with you on that. We're thinking about business first as a mindset, what's important to the business rather than what's important to me. Thinking about the individual, the worker in the workplace, of being listening, empathetic to that, rather than I'm your expert, I am your trainer. Come listen to me, come watch my beautiful design, that kind of empathetic kind of thing. They were more aware, they had a mindset that was much more aware of the fact that they were working with the business rather than for the business. And also this mindset of, really thinking about engagement and improvement in engagement, that process of engagement. So for me, those different characteristics combined with the skill that they had within their own team, it was almost like a six-legged race, Ash. Sort of like, from if all of those started to work together, we made small steps in all of those areas of business, learners, culture, our capability, engagement and impact, all of those 6 areas, we worked together. That consistently over those 15 years of me tracking this led to better business results. Working on one area and not the other didn't lead to business results. It was everything coming together in a much more holistic framework of thinking, which was all driven from what is the outcome that the individual and the organization needs, rather than what's the outcome that I need to prove my own worth. So for me, that didn't change. And I think that's really interesting. Even the research is carrying on right now. The Mind Tools for Business took over that research program, and I've got an amazing research team still maintaining that. And what I'm noticing in the data that's coming through now post-pandemic is those characteristics have not changed. And what's really interesting is in the 20 years, Ash, that we've been tracking what correlates back to business results, the technology never once showed a correlation. So despite all of these tools and techniques that are coming through, all these fancy things that we can do, it was what we do with them in those 6 areas. That is what consistently makes a difference. So what's changed? More tech. Effective practice has not changed. More silver bullets have been shot out from everywhere. They got a model here and an idea there, and so I think there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace at the moment. But sometimes I just think we need to get back to core principles, which is why I was so thrilled when you said we could have this conversation, because I know you get that.
Absolutely. I mean, my gosh, you said so much that I just agree with. I was just like fervently nodding my head as you were speaking, because there's so much there to unpack in terms of, business first attitudes. That to me is such a big deal, because if we're not starting with the business objectives, what are we starting with? Then we're back to that order taker dynamic, where we've got people who don't kind of, again, understand the overarching goals of the organization. They're dealing with more granular training need, and they're coming to the L&D function and saying we need this, and that dynamic we know doesn't work, or is certainly not going to achieve the heady heights of the high achievers you were just describing. I think, for me, you also talked about learner first, what's in it for me, and putting their needs. Again, that helps us achieve those business goals. If we want to achieve the business goals, which are our primary objective, we have to prioritize positioning ourselves to meet the learner need. That, I think, people don't quite understand that. I think, sometimes there's a bit of a gap there, and it blows my mind, but it doesn't really, that the tech never showed any traction, because It's a vehicle. It's, it is an enabler, do not get me wrong, and wow, the things that we can do. I'm running my business fully remotely, all online. Absolutely crazy when you think about that. But it still is very much something that our industry, and many others I'm certain, lean into as a solution. My thoughts are that it's because it's an easy thing. It's a tangible thing. It's much more, it's much easier for us to kind of lean in and say, okay, hey, look, things aren't working from an engagement perspective. No one's logging into the LMS. It must be the LMS's problem. But you're saying the data, even if you change the LMS, because there's all that mindset stuff that sits underneath it, the problem still sits there and it will just rear its ugly head in another year or two, right?
Absolutely. We want the tech to fix the problem, and it won't.
Yeah.
And I think that's the breakthrough moment that we need. Here's another thing, though, Ash, that I think is really interesting. It's how we think about business first, I think, is really important. When I talk a lot about what I now call the L&D value spectrum, it's something that I found has been helpful for me to understand. Where does the learning professionals actually perceive their own value? Going back to mindset, when you're alone and you're thinking about, I wish someone could see how successful I am because I've done X, Y, and Z. Where does that X, Y, and Z fit on the learning L&D value spectrum? Is it in the learning side? Do you see your success in the kind of learning value? Your engagements, your completions, your NPS scores, all the stuff that says, how do they like me? Or is it on the business first end of the spectrum, which is all about, has performance improved? Has culture improved? Have they seen shifts in innovation? When we shift our mindset to really seeing that's where genuinely we personally believe we can contribute our value, the way we think about value then has a knock-on effect in the way that we behave when we're working with the business. Because we're less likely to be saying, I need to prove myself to you, but I am working with you on this business challenge. And we have that mindset of business first, and I'm here to work with you, bring my expertise, bring my instructional design expertise, bring my L&D science knowledge that I have about how the people learn. I want to bring that and add it to your expertise so that we work on this business problem together. That really shifts the mindset. It creates more open conversations with business. We don't have to prove ourselves. And I think one of the challenges is when many of us think business first, it means I've got to show people ROI. And I think that is a really dangerous position for us to be in, because it holds us back. If we feel we're constantly having to prove ourselves, we're never going to be free enough to be genuinely curious about what the problem is. In terms of a mindset of, and strategic marketeers, they're like that. They're not saying I've got a product to sell. They're saying, okay, what's needed here? I'm listening. I'm listening. I want to know what's going on so I can apply my skill to your skills so that we can work out the best way to take something forward.
And I think ROI isn't necessarily just a positive impact on bottom lines. I think that if we're looking at metrics that matter, when you were describing those kind of two different objectives, shall we say, which are kind of more like learner sentiment and attitudes towards learning, which arguably could then lean into things like learning culture, contrasted with overall performance outcomes aligned with business goals, preferably, even if that cascades further down into things like retention, arguably not as an L&D goal that I've seen many times, but surely has an influence and an effect on it nevertheless. So, when you're describing that, I'm thinking, well, that's what a good marketer does, because you're managing two very different threads there, but both of them should complement to achieve the overarching goals. And that's the biggest question of all. What is the purpose of L&D? I was having a discussion with a few friends of mine the other day, and we were saying, if L&D disappeared, would people notice? And it's a contentious subject because of, we work there and it's important to us. But does the business, what does the business want from an L&D function? What do learners want? What are their expectations? I think it's a really interesting thought process in terms of maybe understanding that we're not an essential function, and that's okay. But then again, our mindset needs to be more, we have to influence, we have to persuade, much like a marketer does. We have to go down the road of influencing people to start to think differently about us as a learning function. But that starts with us thinking about ourselves differently as a learning function, right?
Exactly. And we need to really embrace what we can bring to the business, because, would they business notice? I think they wouldn't necessarily notice immediately. When, they don't miss their curriculum of courses or their libraries or whatever it is they've got, or they can just invest in them without us. But they will miss us eventually, even if they don't miss us immediately. And I think the reason is because, in my mind, what is the role of the L&D function? Or the learning professional, or in my newsletter, I'm kind of really tapped into the idea of learning change makers. Are the people who really understand what's needed in the organisation to get people equipped and ready. I think there's been a lot of conversation, rightly, on performance, but it's slightly too narrow. Absolutely, we've got to get people performing in their job and doing their critical tasks better, which means learning in the flow of work, which means peer-to-peer learning, all of those kinds of things. Absolutely, the data says these all make a difference. But only focusing on performance actually stops us thinking about the impact that we can potentially have long-term and strategically within a business. So I like to think of our role as, how do we help people become equipped and ready for the jobs that we need to do today, and also the roles that we need to take on tomorrow. So that has got a greater role in reskilling, in attraction, in attention, in talent, where the silos are coming down. And again, we need a broader mindset in order to say, actually, how do I work with those parts of the business to actually really help achieve those business goals, which are going to be so essential for the future, rather than how I'm a department that's attached to the side of those types of the business. And that, again, it's all about how we see ourselves and our future and who we want to work with and how we work with those people.
Interesting. The common thread that I hear a lot with we talk about high performing L&D functions. Obviously, the sorts of people that I'm collaborating with mass are typically at least more advanced in their approach to L&D. Not to say that they're high performers. I don't get that sort of visibility over their learning outcomes. But I'm curious to understand what threads, or what have you seen in terms of the high performers, those that are really getting impact from their L&D. Is there qualities that you find in those L&D people or those individuals? Is there anything that you can distill it down into, like, barring mindset? We've talked about that, but or what is it? What is it about their mindset? What sort of mindset should they be trying to cultivate? I'm just wondering if there was anything that the data sort of surfaced out that you could say, people who are high performing tend to do this, this, and this. That might be a very, a very distilled down question for you. I apologize.
No, it's a question I've been grappling with for 15 years, to be quite honest. It's, those 6 areas that we talked about earlier are definitely key characteristics which are eternal in those processes. But one of the things that I've looked at post the kind of pandemic is a range of interviews that I did with Michelle Ockers in Australia and Shannon Tipton in Chicago, where we interviewed nearly 30 people right in the heart of when all the change and disruption was happening. And what we found there was that those that were managing their way through, they were less phased than the others. So therefore, at that point in time, were high performing. It was their thinking habits that struck me, rather than their processes. So one of the thinking habits was that they were absolutely business first. This wasn't about the course and preserving the curriculum and sticking everything online. This was about what's happening in the business. How do I roll my sleeves up and get involved? The other thinking habit was about how they saw their personal role. How do they see themselves? Do they see themselves as an expert, or do they see themselves as an empathetic explorer? So that, again, that was a characteristic to kind of distill it down, is that we certainly saw that they didn't leave their expertise behind, but they were willing to be open to new ideas and to find out what was going on. Another thinking habit that they had that was different was their approach to risk. And again, it matched up with the data. So when they looked at having to make a risky decision, then people are either they hold on to what's worked for them in the past and they try and minimize their risk by holding on to what has already worked, or they actually are willing to let go. So again, the high performers in this disruptive change environment we found were more willing to let go of some of the things that had worked from in the past in order to experiment and to try something new and something fresh. And so in terms of mindset, these were, just three of those kind of mindsets that those at that point in time, those that were thriving through disruption were really clear characteristics. There were 5 of them, and I'm happy to share the ebook that we wrote around that. But
great.
It really matched up with the data of the high performing teams earlier. I'd done a study called Embracing Change, and it looked at what the high performing leaders were doing for themselves. And it was all around these things. So 2 different sources of data were really flagging that those mindsets help to set your actions apart, because we know that our thinking informs our behavior, and our behavior informs our feelings, and our feelings inform our thinking. There's that whole cycle of behavior, thoughts, and actions, thoughts, and thinking habits that actually influence who we are and what we do.
Absolutely. And I think, I believe very much you are the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So, exactly the same. If you're kind of cultivating thoughts that aren't progressive or not pushing yourself to perhaps break those patterns of thinking, then, obviously you've got plenty of data to back it up that, nothing's really going to change. That's relatively obvious. Something you said there really struck me, which is, the irony, the cobbler's son's shoes, right? We work in the learning profession, but we are absolutely terrible at focusing on developing ourselves. I think I had a stat shed, and it's from the LinkedIn Learning Report. Compared with other active learners on LinkedIn, L&D learners spend 23 less time learning in 2021 than everybody else. So the learning function learns 23% less than every other function. What can we start doing to help kind of shift our mindsets or change our thinking or develop our skills in these kind of very intangible skills, resilience, innovation, resisting the fear of failure, willingness to experiment. These are all qualities I would expect to see in a very successful marketer. But I think those qualities we really just need in every part of the business these days. So do you have any, again, in those high performers, were you seeing any certain behaviors around developing themselves or things that you've seen that are particularly useful in terms of shifting mindsets, helping build new habits, breaking down those thought processes that aren't necessarily going to help with success in the long term?
Yeah, well, certainly when I did the report on Embracing Change, we really honed into the learning habits of those leading high-performing teams, and it was one of the few times that we put a real lens on that. And I think what struck me, and if I remember rightly, I probably have to go back and read the report myself, but there's a couple of things that we're willing to put ourselves out there. So take on a secondment, getting into the business a lot more, reflection, spending time learning, sort of that paced learning habits of investing in time in myself, and applying learning science to myself. The power of reflection, of journaling, of exposing ourselves to new ideas, of secondments. All of those types of things were actually really strongly there. But I think one of the things that I've been doing since is looking at how we all emerge stronger. And actually, through the Emerging Stronger program that we've been doing, we've been looking at thinking habits, but we've also been looking at what impacts our feeling, what makes us feel stronger, braver, bolder, all the things you were just describing. And a little piece of work that we did, so different things help us feel strong. Like you mentioned already about that peer community of progressive thinkers, that builds your courage and your strength. When I was looking at it, data has always been something that's helped me, being a woman in the edtech world, sort of to get your voice heard in some way. You needed something, and so data for me always was something there. A power of a good mentor, practicing, trying things, experimenting, having permission from ourselves, giving ourselves permission to fail and try things, other people giving us permission. And we've been talking very much about that emotional safety net that we can potentially build for ourselves. And it's one of the things that we feel quite strongly about, is that maybe that emotional safety net, the things that help us feel braver, we need to work out what that means to us, and how do we surround ourselves with more of that, and how do we build a stronger net? Because as each of those different elements I've just described start to interconnect, your peer group start to bring in some evidence. That evidence gives you the courage to try a small experiment. The small experiment then goes back, and you can, do you see what I mean? The net starts to build and strengthen for you. And I think we've talked a lot about skills and how do we build new skills, and I'm pretty sure your masterclass is going to be brilliant for doing that you're going to be doing in the marketing side. But it's then having the courage. How do we make ourselves feel braver? And then how can we recognize how that's impacting how we think about our role as well? Yeah. So these are all very complex kind of psychological things that actually we don't necessarily apply to ourselves, but there's some simple stuff that we can do just to get brave.
I think so. And, and I think the challenge becomes, even if you have, I've spoken to, really, really smart, sharp L&D practitioners who have to leave organizations that they're really passionate about because they cannot get anywhere in terms of evolving the attitudes towards the learning function. And yes, you can you can be the most woke, for want of a better word, L&D practitioner out there, do all the things that you just described. There can still be a really vast amount of resistance internally in organizations. So again, we're up against it because not only do we have these kind of established ways of working and mindsets in ourselves, once we transform that or change our attitudes there, we've still got a task on our hands to then do the same work with our audiences and our stakeholders in our organization. And, that again, I think is where marketing can really come in, because some of what you've just described, that's work we've got to do on ourselves, and you've got to make the time to do that, and you've got to commit to doing that. You've got to build your own habits and understand that stuff does not happen overnight at all. We know this from learning theory, right? Things aren't built overnight. But then we've got this other thing of, okay, well, this is our organization's attitude to learning. How do we change that? You've talked a lot about data, and I think that's where we really need to start, is starting small, looking for those small incremental gains, starting with a pilot. I'm an advocate of not asking permission and apologizing later, but again, some people aren't always so comfortable with doing that, and it does depend on the culture of the organization. Have you seen many, obviously in your time in the industry, you've talked to so many people. How are people breaking down those barriers and shifting attitudes? Business first mindset, great. Partnering with the business. How do you start doing that?
I'm a big advocate of, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. I'm a big advocate of that. And actually, you know what? I even asked that question in the early stages of my study as well. And I did find that those who were more innovative also had that attitude as well. So that's quite helpful. But I think one of the places to get started, is to look for that low-hanging fruit. There'll be some other people out there who have got a challenge that they're willing to talk to you. They're willing to say, actually, let's just try something, because this is too big for me not to try something. And a small part of the business, I think that's really important. What holds us back, though, is our own, we talk about culture. And there was, Beth Hall was a guest on Michelle Ocker's podcast, Learning Uncut podcast, from an organisation called Cotton On Group down in Australia. And she said to me, I felt it was so personal. I felt she said it to Michelle, but it was like it hit home so hard that actually each one of us, as part of something to do with culture, we either invest in our company's culture or we subtract from it. And that really made me think about us as learning professionals. What are we investing in our company's culture, and what are we taking away? Because I think we often look at our culture as with a blame culture. And certainly the data, was always a very high proportion of people saying, my program didn't work because of the learners, the managers, the culture, the learners, the managers, the culture. Wow. Do you know what I mean? So blaming it on everyone else is not the place to start. It's like, where can we make some of those quick wins? Where can we do some of those experiments? What happens if the culture isn't like that? I just haven't tapped into it yet. How will that allow me to spot a new opportunity? How do I start where people are at rather than insisting they start where I'm at? These are all tiny little things that we can ask ourselves. And if those questions allow us to try something different, approach it from a different angle, I think that's when we start to see real change and breakthrough.
I love that we're blaming everybody but ourselves. And so there's no accountability. But why would there be? Because most businesses aren't really asking us to prove ROI or, so it's kind of quite natural for us to be like, well, it's obviously all this other stuff. And, definitely the tech as well. Don't forget that.
Yes, of course it's the tech, yeah.
Yeah, obviously the tech. And that's not to, I don't want to slate tech because it has its place. And I think it's, I've seen amazing things happen with it. I think everything you just said, in my opinion, boils it down to one thought process that I see so commonly in L&D that it blows my mind is that employees want to learn. We operate from that mindset. That the attitude is towards we want to learn. So obviously it's not the program because people want to learn, okay, great. I see that time and time again, and I think it's incredibly debilitating for us actually.
And actually, it's just not the case. When I started a study called Learning Landscape, and it's been continued with Mind Tools. In fact, they've just released the latest version of Learner Intelligence. And one of the questions we asked directly of individuals, and this time they went out through YouGov, to individuals. So I was fascinated by the data. And one of the questions was, what motivates you to dig into finding ways of learning for yourself? And the majority of the time it's because they want to be able to do their jobs faster and better, and it's about their own personal journey and whatever that ambition actually is. It's not that they want to learn, they just want to get on with life.
Yeah, they want the outcomes of learning without the understanding. Yeah,
just that aha moment when I started to see that data come through. It's probably about 7 years ago, and we looked at the millennials, and we looked at, it was before Gen Z when I started to look at this, but we looked at all the different age range, no difference in ages, no real difference in role from apprentice through to director. Why are you investing your own time in doing some stuff like this? It's because they want to do their jobs faster and better. So yep. There is that powerful motivation of people just want to get on with life. They don't necessarily want to be spoon-fed, but they definitely don't necessarily want to come to courses to do it. They just need to find the way of being able to do their jobs faster and better.
It explains our infatuation with learning in the flow of work, whatever that means these days. But, I think that it never was a truer word spoken that unless we can understand the intrinsic motivation of our people, we're never going to connect with them on a learning level. This is why I tell people to go do value proposition canvases. This is why I tell people to focus on what's in it for me. This is why I tell them to talk about benefits instead of features, because suddenly you're talking about here's what you're going to get if you do this, rather than this is a 45-minute e-learning module focused on health and safety. Or that doesn't mean anything to them. If you tell them that you're not going to break your back lifting a box, that's going to mean a little bit more to somebody, on a basic level. This is exactly what we need to start thinking about, is how can we humanize our approach and how can we humanize our people? Because I think sometimes we just think of them as like drones who come to work and, they're just ready to crack on with their compliance training, and, they're just not. And we just need to accept that people aren't interested in learning, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that they won't be. But we need to position it differently. It's not enough to just say, we have a place for you to learn and we have lots of stuff for you to learn.
You just remind me actually of an exercise I did. It was a while back, but I asked a whole range of different learning and development leaders. They brought in, or they sent me their latest marketing material, their posters and their emails and everything else. And all I did was pop it into a word cloud. It was absolutely hilarious. Ash, because and then you present it back to them and say, look, you've been talking about this is the motivation of your learners. This is the motivation of the people who are working, things that are important to them, the what's in it to me. Now let's just compare it with this little word cloud that we have in front of us. There are hardly any matches at all in terms of vocabulary, in sentiment, in the way that we talk about things. It's so important to be able to make that connection. And I'd really like to pick up on your point about the individual as well, because the individual worker is going to be at a different phase according to what their needs are. And we know a lot from learning science about the fact that novices and practitioners and experts all work differently when it comes down to learning. And yet we tend not to reflect that in the way that we connect and market with them. We think everything needs to be in the flow of work. That doesn't always work for a novice who needs more structure, more scaffolding. We believe that the experts are just going to automatically dip into whatever they need, where experts actually can be very blinded by their own expertise and not willing to learn. They sometimes need the challenge of something new. So it's really important, as you say, to tap into the human qualities that will then define the product areas that we, from one of the P's of marketing, the product areas that we need to focus in on, to meet and connect with them at the point where they're at.
That's it. And I mean, when we're really like talking through it and boiling it down, yes, it is complicated. It's not actually hugely difficult at its core, but we have to start thinking, okay, we need our learning experiences to be good, first of all, because we don't want an overpromise and underdeliver situation. You don't want to be doing incredible marketing, raising awareness, and then people go and have, just PowerPoint, next. We're not going to get the learning outcomes that we want, first of all, but second of all, you're certainly going to lose the learner. You have one opportunity to make a good first impression. But say your housekeeping's all sorted and you've got really amazing learning experiences established. You've got a variety, a nice blended approach where it isn't just come and serve yourself. There's actually, like you said, some structure for those that need it, but others, have this kind of flow in the work dynamic. We still need to remind people, Coca-Cola is the most consumed product, barring probably tea. I think that probably is, tea's higher, but they're probably the most purchased consumed product in the world. They still do marketing. They still do branding. They still do adverts on the TV at Christmas with Santa. Yeah, they still keep front of mind because they know that their audience is being bombarded with other things that are just waiting right on the sidelines to immediately grab their attention. So even if their product is good, they still have to continuously market themselves to keep front of mind with the consumer. We don't do that.
You know what? And we're missing a trick. We're missing a trick because if you look at how marketing has evolved with the new technologies, with the role of influencer marketing, with peer-to-peer, sort of social influencing and, all of that kind of thing that's been really a focus of content marketing strategies now. It's not just about the content you pump out, but it's the way people connect and interact and engage and who's listening to who and who's saying what. That to me gives us the most incredible opportunity, not just to keep the voice out there front and foremost, as you say, but it also opens up opportunities in the learning experience to reflect, to practice, to share stories, to work on a project with a new skill, to capture that skill, to understand what those stories are, the videos that are going around. Suddenly those what might be traditional marketing tools also become learning tools and allow us to not just say I just need to keep on marketing, but actually embed the practice into the individual so we can be super smart now borrowing ideas from marketing, particularly peer-to-peer social influencers, championing, all of that kind of thing, to really start to embed new habits in the workers that we're working with, as well as keeping learning at front and foremost. So I am really excited about the new overlap between marketing and learning, but not just about the promotion, but how we can use those techniques to reinforce habit and behavior change and culture within the organization.
Definitely, because I think campaigns is one small piece of a marketing pie. You know, the branding stuff, like I find that way more interesting. Like how do we actually influence or affect someone's attitudes towards us? Like that is a difficult thing to quantify at times, but that's what good branding does. And, you know, I did an episode on branding because I read a quote somewhere that was, you know, brands only exist in the mind of the person interacting with it. And like that just like scrambled my brain for a second. And I was like, it's so true, because again, we fixate on the tangible assets of a brand, you know, our iconography, our fonts, our colors, the visual language of the brand, tone of voice, messaging frameworks, whatever. But all of that's concocted to create an emotion in somebody. That's basically it.
But it's also how you feel when you interact with that brand, how the individual, how the department, how the responsiveness, you know, of that organization who's carrying that brand. Does it all tie in together? Does it all reflect it? You can have a great icon and your great brand colors, but it says energy, and then if it's tired and lackluster experience, you're not going to be connected with that at all.
In fact, it'll have the converse effect, I think, because you've done what I mentioned earlier, where you've overpromised and underdelivered, or you're not consistent in your messaging, and so people are expecting one thing. Like I've talked about this a lot in terms of like, you know, logos and like what does something say about something. Like we've got to accept and understand that we live in a world of stereotypes, biases, and many unconscious things are operating in people's brains so that they can quickly and swiftly interpret the world. So you choose a color flippantly. And actually that has, you know, color language. There's a whole realm of psychology and psychological analysis around color language and how that communicates to people with a color, you know, never mind, you know, the over-reliance on dry, dull stock imagery. You know, what's that making someone feel if beyond boredom? You know, so I'm absolutely with you. You know, that feeling, that emotion is what we're trying to, you know, latch onto, and we could do more with the emotions that we can foster in people too. You know, it doesn't always have to just be like heart fingers and everything's the best ever. You know, I would love us to leverage those slightly more negative emotions. The fear of failure, the fear of being left behind, I think is a really big one from a career perspective. If we're looking at either upskilling or reskilling our employees, which we're likely to given current circumstances, then surely one of the biggest intrinsic motivators we could ignite in them is don't get left behind. You know, the world is changing. This is the skills that you're going to need, whether you're here or somewhere else, are X, Y, and Z. How are you going to get them if you don't focus on developing yourself?
And again, another thing about marketing mindset is the fact that actually marketers are quite happy to experiment, to do things like A/B testing and things like that. So, you know, you could have a hypothesis that say, if we tap into people's kind of fear of being left behind, then we will be able to see whether or not they'll be engaging with us. So, you know, but we can test that out, do small little experiments to see what connects with people and what doesn't. And also those experiments then surface new data, new understanding, new empathy with the audience that we're connecting with. So I think if we want that empathy, then marketing can actually give us a wide range of tools to be able to connect better with the audiences, and it gives us a creative way when we combine marketing techniques with what we know as experts in learning design. Then actually it's a concept of like of idea sex. There's nothing new under the sun, but when two ideas come together, something new is created. And that's what excites me about the overlap between marketing and with learning, is the new opportunities that both departments can learn from each other.
You don't have to be me who's worked in, you know, in-house marketing roles for 10 years to be able to take some of the key stuff that marketers do and employ effectively every day. You know, I like little things, copywriting, put some energy and time into what you write and how you say it, and thinking about, again, how people are going to interact with it, what's it going to do for them. You know, I think testing is so important, and it's something, again, we're not always so comfortable doing or good at doing. And I guess my one concern is, if we send one email and we're testing a fear thing, let's not take that as truth then and be like, yeah, everyone reacts well to fear. Like, okay, you've got your hypotheses, go and continue to stress test that, because that's the reality. We can't get like, you'll know this way more than me with the data analysis that you've done in your time. I say it's data informed, not data led, and that's the way that I think we should be thinking. Get data and then let that data give you more hypotheses to continue to test and learn and test and learn and never stop.
Yeah, exactly. And also what you're doing is you're building up your own experience. And that's what I love about evidence-informed decision making. The evidence that we use is the data that comes in, the data that comes from other people, the interviews we have with other people, and our own experiences. All of those combined to give multiple sources of insight that allow us to inform our decisions and make us smarter as we go through. And that's a lesson from so marketing, it's a lesson from learning and development, it's a lesson from data analysis. There's where all these worlds collide and there's some commonality. It's for a reason. Yeah. It's because it's smart.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing I would say as well is your learnings in one organization might not necessarily always translate to another. So, because it's a different audience. So you've got to learn what works for your people. That's nothing more, like someone will say to me, well, what are you doing on LinkedIn? How are you employing these tactics? What's working? I can tell you some of the basics, some of the, what I would say are universal truths about something when it comes to marketing. But beyond that, you've got to learn what's going to work with your audience. Like that, you've got to just put in the time. You've got to put in the desire to want to test, to be willing to fail and concoct experiments and ideas that are actually going to give you useful data, meaningful metrics that you can then action further to stress test and examine further.
And that comes back to mindset. It brings us full loop round to mindset, because actually, are we willing to listen, to explore, to let go, but always to have business first as our North Star, is being the one red thread that pulls through all of our work that we bring, to our industry and to the role that we have. And I think that if there's anything I've learned over the years, it's that willingness to adapt and flex and flow and try it. That's been so critical, but always with one goal in mind, which is about making improvements in the organization.
What a wonderful way to end the podcast. I was going to ask you if there was like one key takeaway for everybody, but you pretty much just nailed it there. Laura, thank you so much. I could probably chat to you for another 5 or 6 hours. I feel like I said, we're definitely cut from the same fabric, and thank you so much for sharing so much, meaningful information around, the research that you've done. We'll definitely share that ebook that you mentioned in the show notes. If people want to find you, can they find you on your LinkedIn, and how do they sign up for your newsletter, for example?
Yes, I do a newsletter called #LearningChangemakers on LinkedIn. It is not regular. I probably need a bit of advice from you there, Ash. But, that's this place where most people find me, is through on LinkedIn. Really happy to connect with people, really happy to take questions on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter as well, both at Laura Overton.
Fabulous. Okay, well, like I said, I'll put all that detail in the show notes as well, just so it's easy for people to find. On behalf of myself and everybody who's listened today, thank you so much for your time, Laura. Incredible insights.
Oh, thank you. It's really great to just chat about these things.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful afternoon.